Welcome to today's episode of Picture This. I am really excited to introduce my good friend and our guest, an award-winning author whose vibrant stories have delighted young readers and families for years. Her impressive body of work includes picture books such as Duck, Duck, Moose, Chickens Run Wild, one of my favorites of all time, Tyrannosaurus Rex, Hampire, the empowering anthem Chicks Rule. I would like to take a big moment to welcome Sudipta Bardhan-Quallen.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. You know that I am a huge, huge fan of your picture books. I know you do write a couple of series of longer form chapter books, which are also a lot of fun. Do you want to tell our audience a little bit about the difference between picture books and chapter books for you when you're doing school visits?
Yeah, well, the difference between picture books and chapter books, I feel like they're two different worlds, right? The way that you inhabit a story in a picture book, it is all encompassed in that one book. Yeah, sometimes you might have sequels with the same characters or companion books or something like that, but the plan has always got to be you've got 32 to 40 pages and you're creating a world, you're creating a whole situation, you're creating an adventure that kids are going to want to know the end of, right? In this very confined space. Whereas with chapter books, it's a little bit different. The idea for most chapter books is that they're going to be at least a short-lived series, if not a longer series, right? So you are not just creating one adventure and one set of characters, but you're kind of inhabiting a whole world that needs to be multifaceted enough that you can keep exploring it over and over again. And in terms of how you approach them in a school visit, a lot of the times, even with older grades, I tend to still read picture books to the group that I'm talking to, just because they're manageable, right? You can read the entire thing. Nobody's left hanging. Nobody's like, oh my goodness, what am I supposed to do now? I don't know what's going to happen next. However, I find myself talking more about character development even with chapter books, with even younger kids, because there is so much more of those moments you have in chapter books to kind of get into a character's head and really explore some of the emotional things that kids are experiencing. With a picture book, you are exploring an emotion, but it's often very limited, right? And the solution is very limited, right? Whereas in chapter books, you might have a main character who, for example, is a little bit of a scaredy cat. Well, in an adventure she has, she might learn to be brave, but only in one very particular situation. And the next time we see her, she's still a scaredy cat. That's who she is. And I think that's very validating for kids, right? Because they don't have to feel like I have to stop this part of me that maybe I'm a little, anxious about or sensitive about. I don't have to stop being a little bit of a chicken about things. It's okay if I'm building my bravery, in individualized ways and ways that are important for my life to move forward, while still retaining my fear of horror movies like I have my entire lives, right? So I think that there's a different experience, and just the way that you kind of want kids to think about what a book can do for them is a little different between a chapter book and a picture book.
You have a science background, right? You went to California Institute of Technology. You have written also nonfiction. I haven't written any nonfiction. I won a nonfiction award for a book I made up, but I never wrote any nonfiction. So do you feel like nonfiction lends itself better to that kind of programming, or do you feel like having the creativity of a fiction work lends itself better to creating a good school visit?
I think that they work in different ways. I don't know that they're necessarily comparable. The way that I would talk about a nonfiction story really has to do much more with research and things like that. Right. If I'm writing a nonfiction picture book, I actually just sold one to Charlesbridge about tigers at night and their nocturnal behaviors and kind of the nocturnal world that they live in. And so there's a lot of research that goes into that. If you're writing a nonfiction picture book for young children, it's usually kind of approximating a narrative, even if it is incorporating nonfiction facts. So you're still thinking about character and things like that, but you're very confined within what is real. You can't just make things up. It would be really great if the tigers could do this, but they don't. So I can't have that scene. However, when I write fiction, maybe because of my science background, I do a lot of non-fiction-y research to get there. I try to think about when I'm putting a group of animals together, for example, in a story, they usually kind of have to exist in the same habitat, or else I wouldn't put them together. It's this very weird thing because on the one hand, they're talking animals wearing clothing, but on the other hand, I think it would be weird if a capybara were to interact with a kangaroo unless the capybara flew to Australia, kind of a thing. So I think that there's a lot of research in terms of facts that authors of fiction have to do to make their worlds believable, especially when you're writing something short and you don't have an adult novel length of room to create a world and explain the logic and all those things. You need to kind of rely on things that people already know and trust to be able to, kind of make sense.
And kids are smart. They'll know a capybara and a kangaroo don't live in the same place.
Exactly.
They might not be able to spell either of the words, but they'll call you on it and
Absolutely.
say, capybaras don't live in Australia.
Absolutely. The only way you can do that is if they're in a zoo. You can have them in a zoo together. But I mean, that's also thoughts to think about, right? Like, do you have these characters in what would approximate their home, right? And what would that look like? You wouldn't put a capybara going to school in an igloo, for example, because that wouldn't make sense to the reader kind of on a gut level. And so understanding those things, and I'm not just talking about animals, right? When we're talking about books that are exploring emotional intelligence, I do a lot of reading about child psychology and development. And I think about how am I going to tie in these real things that they're already feeling and kind of where we're trying to guide them to appropriately into the story that I'm writing. They don't really need to understand that maybe at your high school reunion, you'll actually find things in common. That's not something they can experience. So thinking about what are the real experiences that, again, that nonfiction research, that real learning informs the way at least I tell stories. And when I'm teaching, it's the way I ask, writers to think about their stories and their characters.
And I know you do a lot of teaching with adults as well as bringing your work into schools. Do you find that there's a parallel between how you can bring a writing lesson to different levels, whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school, or adults? And if you do, what are the things that you can take from that when we're thinking about creating lessons for multiple levels?
Absolutely. So one of the things I like to do when I'm teaching writing to kids is I try to teach it to them the way I would teach adults. Obviously not maybe as detailed. When I have a class that I'm talking to, it might be several hours of lecture, it might be several weeks of class, right? So I'm able to go into more depth, but kind of the basics of it, I try to teach them the same way because I think that kids really respond to feeling like they're being treated like real people. Like, this is not some weird little worksheet I made because I was coming to your school. This is the graphic organizer that I use when I'm taking people who want to be published authors, when I'm taking them through the paces to teach them how to write a story. One exercise that I do a lot when I do writing workshops at schools is this graphic organizer for character and plot. And what I ask the kids to do in this is very quickly sketch out a character name, a little bit of a description of that character, what that character's goal is, what they want most in the world. And then I have them think about, well, what are the things that are keeping them from getting that thing that they want most in the world? Explaining that as soon as the character gets what they want, the book is over. So if they get what they want on page 3, the book is over. You have no more book. That is obviously the basics of a plot and the basis of kind of getting an idea of what a character is. I do this exercise with kids from a blank page because I want them to see that they actually have a leg up on grown-ups in one way. They already have the ideas in the imagination. What they don't have necessarily is the confidence to think that they are good ideas. So I want to take them through this really quickly so that they don't have time to doubt themselves. They're just getting it down on paper. So in the span of about 15 minutes, I will guide a group through this where I have them start in the middle. I have them write down a name. I tell them it doesn't matter what name it is. It doesn't matter if you have a character in mind or you've never thought of it, just any name, because the moment you start thinking of a name, you start to get an idea in your head. If I tell you I have one duck character whose name is Quackenstein and I have another duck character whose name is Duck, they don't sound like the same character right from the names. So I have them pick a name. then I have them just start writing whatever comes to mind. I tell them they can use nouns. Is it a girl, a boy? Is it an animal, a human? Whatever. They can use adjectives. Are they brave? Are they shy? Are they anxious? They can use short phrases. I have them write at least 3 things very quickly, and then I immediately say, now I want you to think about what this character wants most in the world. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if this thing is really important. The only thing that matters is that thing that they want, is it really important to them? This was one of the best pieces of advice an editor ever gave me, that the story problem in a book does not have to be important. It just has to be important to the character who's living it. At that point, I usually stop and I'll ask the group for some examples, and we'll get everything from wants intergalactic peace to wants a bicycle because everybody else on the block has a bike, and that's the way that they're going to go and join and make friends. Letting them get this out quickly really gets them to first see how different stories can be and what good ideas are and how easy it can be for them if they don't overthink it. And then obviously the next step is thinking of those problems, and that's another place where you see just such a range of things that kids come up with. And for me, the only critique I ever give them is, does it make sense for the character and the goal that you set up? If your character goal is getting a bike and the problem is that they're a mouse, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. That makes sense to me. I understand why that might be an issue. If your character's goal is to solve Mideast peace and they're a mouse, maybe we need to rethink one part of this story. And so, not that it couldn't work, but it's something you have to think about. Then the other thing that's really powerful about that is giving them the power to cross things out and change them as they think about the story. This is hard for grown-up writers, right? They feel like
the editing process for anyone, and I always ask people in my visits or when I'm teaching adults, how often do you revise? How many times do you think I revised this book? And I'll hold up one of my books. No one who isn't familiar with how many times you have to revise something to get it published has anything even close. Longest number of revisions I have is for wordplay, and that was 53. Some of them were revisions for editors that never got bought, or but you always take something from that and use it in the next story or the next revision. That revision process and having ways to get students to understand how much better your writing gets just by going through it one time. How much better does it get if you go through it again?
Any writer, when we write, it's our voice. It matters to us. And we wouldn't put it down on paper unless we thought it was really good. And you have this investment in it. And this idea of like changing what you've just invested into feels awful. But I usually tell kids, I ask them to raise their hands if they hate revising. And most of them raise their hands. And then I say, you are one step closer to being a professional author, because we all hate it. No one likes to be told that these words that we cared so much to put them down on paper and then show someone else aren't the best words. And so if you care about what you're writing, you are closer to being an author than someone who doesn't.
It's so true. I have a manuscript that's out right now, and it has really good interest from somebody. And they asked me to change 2 lines, like 2 lines, and they're not 2 connected lines. They're just 2 separate lines. Basically, they're saying, change this word and change this word. It took me a week for 2 words, And when it finally hit me, I was like, dumbass, just add this word here. And then it makes complete sense, right? Yeah. But you sit there and you stare at it and you're going, but it was so good the way that I had it.
You fight it and you do the revision, and then you're like, oh, well, that is better.
Sometimes the editors have good ideas.
Yeah.
That's why they're the editors. So we have already talked about one of the strategies that you use when you go into schools. What kinds of tips would you offer to educators for how to use some of your stories for lessons in class?
The first thing is always check out the author's website, because like if you go on my website, I have already created a lot of activity pages that go with most of my books. And some of them are just fun, but a lot of them have to do with some kinds of skills that you would be teaching in the classroom. There's always a crossword, which is literacy. Usually I have some kind of a short writing thing. Sometimes it's an acrostic poem with my newest book, Cats in Construction Hats, there's a worksheet that's titled, I can do this, I can do that. Because throughout the book, the cats can do this, the cats can do that. So asking kids to write down what things they can do. So thinking about the writing, but also thinking about themselves, understanding themselves. Another thing to use with my books, since a lot of them are in rhyme, is to kind of talk about rhyming words. And if you're talking with really young kids, you're talking about how to decode words that kind of look a little bit the same. So if you know how to read cat, then maybe this one that starts with an R isn't going to be so bad. Maybe this one that starts with a DR is going to be something that you can get, right? So that's for young kids. With older kids, you start to ask them to think about, how do words sound? And does it sound different when the words rhyme versus if I'd used a synonym that didn't rhyme with this? Like what does that affect for you? To have them start thinking about how language affects the experience that the reader is having with this story and how the reader connects to this story.
Yeah, and that comes back to what we were just talking about with one word, right?
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with somebody previously, how much one word changes a sentence, even a 2-word sentence.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe especially a 2-word sentence.
Yeah, birds fly, birds eat, birds dive.
Yeah.
All these simple, it's one word, and how that can change your story. Exercises with that and how you can write a story where one word is static and you have one, or maybe 2 words are static and you have one word that you can change and you have to write a 4-sentence story with that. So I really like that idea.
The most recent book I sold, which maybe I shouldn't talk about, but I'll just throw out there, it's about capybaras. That's why I've got capybaras in the brain. And the entire book is basically words I made up that kind of rhyme with capybara. So there's bara, there's unhappy bara, there's make it snappy bara, there's clappy bara. And so again, it's actually changing a little part of the word, right? But I'm kind of using it as a longer sentence, right? How clappy bara doesn't sound like sappybara at all, right? Again, no context, no story, no picture, no nothing. You think an unhappy bara does not look the same as a happy bara, even though they kind of do look the same. Now that I think about it, but
they do.
And
not
so
the most expressive faces on those things.
And Ann Appert is illustrating it, and they are so talented in using such a small amount of. I would say the small amount of the art, and I'm sure they would say you have no idea what art is. That was not a small amount, but these little details, how they use to just convey so much emotion, it is really impressive. And actually, Lisa Hernandez does a lot of that in Cats in Construction Hats as well, where there's just this little difference in the angle of the cat's eyebrows or a little elongation of the mouth or something.
She does that so well in all of her books, where it's, if you watch some of the background characters and how they react to the story, it really changes your perception of what's going on. And you can sometimes read a story through that. I love when illustrators do that.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to work with her, especially on sparse manuscripts. She and I now have 4 books together. So Roxy Loves Adventure was the first one, and that's kind of more of a traditional story. It's not, it's not long, but it's not what I would consider a sparse text. But there are so many details in Roxy and so many inside jokes in that. For example, all through the book, there are these little hedgehogs that are scattered around because the real Roxy loves hedgehogs to the point where we have to buy stacks of them because she'll get one and rip its face off. And then once its face is gone, then she needs a new hedgehog. So there are all these little things. All the clothes that the book Roxy is wearing, they're basically the real Roxy's clothing. So there are all these details with Cats in Construction Hats and the follow-up that'll come out next year, I guess, called Cats in Conductor Hats, where they're on a train. And Alpaca does that in school. They're much sparser text, right? So there's so many more opportunities for her to really take the story to a brand new level. And because Lisa and I are very good friends and we work together, all of these books were collaborations from the beginning. And so there are all these things that we were able to discuss and establish so that I wouldn't have to overwrite these bits and I wouldn't have to put them in the illustration notes or anything for the editorial process, but they were there. One of the things is in Cats in Construction Hats, this idea that there were these rats that are running through and kind of creating chaos, right? It started with in a place where the disaster happens and we hear boom, crash, splat, rats. And at first it was just the word rats, like, oh, darn, kind of a thing. But then we thought, well, what if they're actually real rats? And that is an idea that we were kind of able to come up with together. Now, she made it work. Obviously, she's the one who did the drawings. But there's this whole other story of teamwork between the cats and the rats that is completely different from the teamwork between the cats themselves that wouldn't exist without the details in the art.
And here's another idea that brings up is creating things with a friend. Whether it's you're an illustrator and they're an author or vice versa, or just writing something together and how that changes. So you and I tried to write something together. I thought it was hilarious. My agent.
Yeah.
But
great.
Look, I loved the process of it, and I loved working with you. It was so much fun, and like that whole manuscript makes me laugh when I go back and look at it. But writing with a friend is a lot of fun. We've covered a bunch of those kind of things. I want to get into a little bit of the interactive, here's Adam's kind of standard segment. So I have one called Adam's Book Bag.
Okay.
I'd love for you to talk about picture book that you use a lot of the time in lessons, whether it's yours or somebody else's.
Well, I am going to avoid talking about my own books, even though those are the ones that I use mostly when I'm giving talks, not because I'm a better writer than everybody else. It's just that I happen to know my books really well. And I know where the author succeeded in getting what she wanted across and where it didn't come, quite as close as she wanted. However, I'm gonna give some shout outs to a book that I love so much. I am so jealous that I did not write this book. It's called We Love Fishing by Ariel Bernstein. It is hilarious. It is not only just funny, it's about 4 friends who go fishing, and they all love fishing except Squirrel, who really doesn't like fishing. And they all can't wait to eat their new fish dinner, and Squirrel's like, fish are a little slimy. And it's not only hilarious from just kind of the reserved way the text doesn't put anything in your face, right? It just it's very deadpan, and the humor comes from that. But it's also this really deep story about friendship and how if you have a group of 4 friends, there is always a squirrel. And in any group I'm in, I am definitely the squirrel. So reading this book and going through with my friends, I'm like, and you're bear, and you're rabbit, and I'm squirrel, right? It's just such a perfect example of what picture books are supposed to do. Picture books are supposed to be a relationship building tool, right? They are read by one person to another person. So it is always about a relationship, and a book like that immediately lets you spring to your own experience is doing exactly what a picture book is supposed to accomplish, and it does it so well in such sparse text, just with so much humor. Like I said, I am so jealous that I did not write that book.
And everyone, no matter what age you are, has been in a situation where someone is enjoying themselves and you're not at that same level of enjoyment.
Absolutely.
And that can be the writing assignment that goes along with that. Is what is a time, tell us about a time that you did that. You can do it in a poem, you can do it in a picture, right?
Absolutely. And you weren't as excited. You weren't as excited, but you didn't want to not be included. Right? That's the thing. You think as grown-ups, if my 3 friends want to go fishing and I don't want to go fishing, I say, fine, you guys go. Spaces are our togetherness. When the reality is, I'll probably go and I'll probably scroll it all up the entire time, right?
I got my boat driving license so that I can hang out on the boat while everybody's fishing. I don't mind fishing. Like, it's fine. But it's a dirty thing. I'd rather drive the boat and have a drink and just, just hang out in the sun.
Fish are slimy. And it's really hot out there, and it's kind of boring.
So next one is Story Sparks. We're going to share just a creative prompt for teachers to spark student engagement.
So one thing I would say is, if you want to convince your parents to do something, you probably want to come up with 3 reasons, because less than 3 reasons, it's not going to necessarily feel like enough to them. And more than 3, it starts to feel like you're piling on. 3 is that magic number. It's the same with stories, right? Like you want to have the experience with your character where you feel like they've really earned it, but you don't want to be bored, right? You don't need 16 things that they've done to earn it, but you don't want it to be so quick that you haven't enjoyed the experience. So 3 is that sweet spot. And we talk about the three little bears and the three little pigs, or the three bears, sorry, the ox and the three bears and the three little pigs, and kind of three is something we see over and over again. So it is something that just works for us. But I also kind of talk about, because I use repetition a lot, how fun it is to say something over and over again, and until you get to three, it isn't really repetition, right? At two, it's just random, right? At three, it's like, oh, I'm doing this deliberately. So, those chicks run wild, those chicks run wild, those chicks run wild. Then it becomes a theme. Before that, it isn't a theme. But I do have one story sparking idea, though, that I'd like to throw out there for people. I'm a huge pun fan. I think you know that from just knowing me. I love going to like the Target kids section, or to Gymboree, or to Children's Place, or any of these kids stores, and read the graphic t-shirts and look at the puns they're using on the graphic t-shirts. And those can be just a treasure trove of ideas. You just take that one little image and then see what you can do with it, especially because a lot of them have an image as well. That's really helpful for a lot of kids, because some kids are, word thinkers, others are visual thinkers.
I love that you mentioned that, because the story that I have on submission right now, it's a t-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is a t-shirt. When you hear about it, you're gonna go, yeah. Like it is. And I've seen the t-shirt before. I didn't write it because of the t-shirt, but I wrote it because that concept is just funny.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are t-shirts of it says, like, yeah, it is.
So you're right.
It's hilarious,
Yeah.
right? And one of the lines that I was asked to change is actually the line that's on the t-shirt.
That's because everybody's a critic.
Yeah, they're like, can we not say that? I'm like, but can we still make our own t-shirts? Because I need it. So I love that. So the last thing I want to cover with you is I'd like to take a second and just talk about diversity in the stories you choose, in the way you think about sculpting the next project. How much do you think about that? Where do you think there are ways for us to bring that further into the classroom?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think most of my books at some level are about finding how you fit in the world. That comes from both my own experience. My parents were immigrants. I grew up in New Jersey. First half of my life, we were in North Jersey, which was much more diverse. Second half, we were in South Jersey, which at the time was far less diverse. It was difficult, kind of feeling like I didn't really fit with people that I was growing up with. And, kids feel that way, even if they're exactly like everybody around them. That's just a normal way to feel. It's a little exacerbated, right, when you have other things there that are making you feel that way. And so I think that there's that level that I bring to my stories. And also, I'm the mother of biracial children, right? So I don't ever think of them as biracial. I think of them as my kids. And very funny little detail, my oldest daughter, when she was very little, she would describe her family like this. She would say, my mommy is brown, my daddy is pink, and I am skin color. And what I loved about, not only is it hilarious, but it actually made me realize something about kids. They define themselves as normal, and then they define the rest of the world in relation to themselves, right? But as the mother of biracial kids, I wonder, what are other people seeing my kids as? Are they seeing them as brown or pink or some mix, or skin color? Hopefully skin color, but let's be honest, probably not, right? And so I am always kind of thinking about, how do people get past that fear of, do I fit in? How do they find a niche for themselves even when they're different? Like, one of the things in Cats and Construction Hats is each of the cats is individually excellent, right? They can do their job, and they can do it really well. And they could have just kept doing their job for the rest of their careers, and they would have been fine, right? But when they come together, they're good at something, not in a better way, just in a different way. And for me, that was a little bit of a lesson that I think is important for kids to get starting when they're young. They don't have to be bad to be good in a group. They don't have to be bad at things. Even if you're really good at the things you like, there might be other things that you can be better at if you're working with other people. And even if you think perfectly, you fit perfectly as a yellow cat in a green hat doing this particular job, maybe there's a place for a yellow cat with a green hat doing something slightly different when they're working with others as well. So I don't often think about it in terms of human children and human diversity, partly because I write really young books, partly because I write really kind of wackadoodle stories. And when you're dealing with actual issues of race and ethnicity and religion and things like that, you don't necessarily want to be wackadoodle with it. You want to have some sensitivity that you bring into it. So a lot of my stories do have to do with animals or things like that, but the heart of it is still there, right? The taking somebody or an animal that might be in a situation that they were familiar and then take them someplace that feels unfamiliar.
Kids will make that connection. We don't have to hit them over the head with a story about biracial children, a story about immigrant children. We can. I mean, there is definitely a place for those stories, but there's also a place for us to take a story like Cats in Construction Hats and talk about those issues in the way that you just did.
Yeah.
Right. And present them in a way that says, we're talking about diversity. We're talking about inclusion. We're talking about finding ways to work as a team. Maybe you talk about it in terms of sports. If you're going to go out and play tennis, maybe you're by yourself, but if you're going to play a team sport, you have to be good working with other people.
Even in tennis, right? Yeah, you can play by yourself, but you can have even more success if you're on a doubles team, right? And so there's almost everything you can kind of find some facet where working with someone else, even if what you're doing is working with your coach, right? You're not working on your own, even when you're in an individual sport, right? You are still working with people on your team. Just because they're not on stage with you doesn't mean that you're by yourself.
I really like that a lot. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. I want to remind people to like, share, comment, ask questions. I can tell you, if you ask a question in the comments to Sudipta, she's probably going to respond.
I will do my very best.
So definitely interact. And yeah, thanks again for being part of this.